original PlayStation, also known as PSX or PS1, was my first ever video game console, and it's what really got me into video games today. In fact, some of my favorite video games appeared on this system, especially when it came to horror games. Yeah, even as a kid, I was a big horror game fan, to the point where I literally played as many horror games that I could possibly get my hands on. And to this day, it remains one of my favorite video game consoles of all time, just for the mere fact that it had so many unique survival horror games available on it. So I figured now is the perfect time to honor the PS1 as I give you guys my top 10 PS1 survival horror games of all time. For the record, I'll only be focusing on games that debuted on the PlayStation 1, not ported versions of PC games. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 best PlayStation 1 survival horror games. Let's get it. Number 10, Dino Crisis 2. As one of the best dinosaur horror games even today, Dino Crisis 2 was one of the best survival horror experiences on the PlayStation. While it may not have been as good as the first game of the series in my opinion, it still delivered everything that you could possibly hope for from a dinosaur horror game. Dangerous dinosaurs? Check. Variety of different types of dinosaurs? Check. A lot of dinosaurs in general? Check. Hell, that last part was even more impressive for its time, considering the amount of dinosaurs that Dino Crisis 2 would feature on the screen at the same time compared to its predecessor. While the story may have jumped off the rails just a little bit and the gameplay definitely leaned heavily towards action horror over survival horror, it was still a fun experience that was a major part of my childhood. Number 9, Koudelka. Unfortunately, I never got to fully experience Koudelka until many years after the PS1's life cycle, but man, am I glad that I finally got around to playing it for the first time. This is without a doubt one of the best horror RPGs out there, and if you're looking for a cross between survival horror and RPG, this is it. And I don't mean action RPG like you see with Parasite Eve, I mean traditional turn-based RPG mechanics that eventually inspired the Shadowheart series. Don't get me wrong, the game is not perfect. The story is, well, it's something, and some of the fundamentals of the game is far from being polished, even considering when it released. However, Koudelka's combination of survival horror, puzzle solving, elements of atmospheric horror, and most importantly, turn-based RPG mechanics that would later inspire the Shadowheart series are all the reasons why this hidden gem earns itself a spot in the top 10 best PS1 survival horror games of all time. Number 8, Alone in the Dark, A New Nightmare. While A New Nightmare may not be the only Alone in the Dark game on the PS1, it's definitely the best one. In fact, I would argue that A New Nightmare may very well be the best entry of the entire series. Yeah, even better than the original game of the series and its 2024 remake. As Resident Evil once took inspiration from Alone in the Dark, A New Nightmare decided to take inspiration from Resident Evil as it gave us the best survival horror experience in the entire Alone in the Dark series. Rather, it's the creepy mansion, the fixed camera angles, the focus on atmospheric horror and puzzle solving, two different scenarios following two different protagonists, or the zombie-like enemy types. A New Nightmare is not afraid to wear its inspiration on its sleeve. Despite that though, A New Nightmare also shocked us with some of its own innovative mechanics, including the flashlight mechanic, in which it could be used to solve puzzles, scare certain monsters away, and even lower defenses on other enemies of the game. Overall, Alone in the Dark, A New Nightmare was a soft reboot for the franchise, and it was arguably the best the series has ever been in terms of the focus on survival horror. Number 7, Parasite Eve. Koudelka might be the best turn-based RPG survival horror game on the PS1, but Parasite Eve does a much better job at integrating its action RPG mechanics with survival horror in a way that just makes it feel natural and easy to use. Unlike Koudelka, Parasite Eve is an action RPG, which means the player is given full control of Aya's movements during combat, allowing her to dodge attacks and attack from different angles. It was a system that, while it took some getting used to, was extremely impressive, and to this day, it's really shocking that no one else has captured this same gameplay style in a survival horror setting. Still, unlike its successor, Parasite Eve still lacked a lot of survival horror mechanics due to it primarily focusing on the RPG side of things, but despite that, Parasite Eve still manages to be one of the most unique and exciting survival horror games on the PS1. Number 6, Resident Evil 3, Nemesis. The more I replay RE3 Nemesis, the more I want to move it higher on this list. Actually, when I first played this game as a child, I was surprisingly disappointed with this game. I guess I was so used to some of the mechanics seen in its predecessors, like multiple scenarios featuring two playable characters, but looking back on this game, I was extremely hard on it back then. RE3 featured a lot of the mechanics that I really did enjoy, some of which I actually want to see featured in a future game. For example, the life selection system is something that created a ton of replayability, and the lack of branching narratives in current Resident Evil games allows me to appreciate this game a lot more for what it was. And let's not forget that the most iconic stalker enemy in a video game appeared in RE3 Nemesis. This unpredictable monster was far beyond its time, as it completely kept the player on their toes throughout every moment of Resident Evil 3. Sure, Mr. X in RE2 and Scissors Man in Clock Tower came first, but it was Nemesis that ultimately put stalker enemies on the map. And let's not forget that Jill Valentine proved that she was not some damsel in RE3, she was a badass and would continue to be one from this point on. Finally, the last thing that I really appreciated about RE3 that I think it did better than every other Resident Evil game out there is the fact that it has some of the most challenging puzzles throughout the entire RE series. That's something I've always appreciated in survival horror games, and RE3 Nemesis arguably does it better than any other Resident Evil game out there. Number 5, Dino Crisis. There's two different types of Dino Crisis fans out there, ones that prefer the survival horror focused first game, and ones that prefer the action horror focused second game of the series. As you can tell with this list, I consider myself as a member of that first group. Ultimately, it comes down to two words: survival horror. I love the second game, and I still have a lot of fun playing through it, but when it comes to which game is scarier and feels more like a survival horror game, the first game just fits that bill more in my opinion. Sure, you don't get those insane battle sequences with a bunch of dinosaurs on the screen at the same time like you do in the second game, but the first game does a much better job at making each dinosaur terrifying and dangerous, which is what a survival horror game should feel like. I shouldn't be running and gunning in my survival horror games. I should be cautiously making my way through the areas and avoiding combat when I can. The first Dino Crisis captures the essence of true survival horror better than the second game. I mean, every time a random raptor busted through a door and attempted to kill me, I was filled with fear and anxiety as I had to quickly put it down or get the hell out of there as soon as possible. The first Dino Crisis is a true masterpiece, and it's one that I don't think we'll ever see replicated again. Right now, there's a big gap in the video game industry for a good dinosaur horror game, and I hope one day Capcom or some other studio out there capitalizes on that and delivers us some other survival horror dinosaur game that at least comes close to what the first Dino Crisis game accomplished. Number 4, Parasite Eve 2. I feel like I might be a little high on Parasite Eve 2, but every time I think about my experience with this game, whether it's my first time playing it or as recent as playing through it again a few months ago, I absolutely love this game. My biggest complaint with the original Parasite Eve was the fact that the game didn't do a great job of finding the middle ground between survival horror and RPG. It was mostly a JRPG with horror elements to it. Parasite Eve 2, on the other hand, included many more survival horror mechanics that allowed it to feel like a true hybrid video game. From having a more simplified and freeform combat style to having difficult and challenging puzzles that would give the Silent Hill franchise a run for their money. Parasite Eve 2 did everything that you would expect from a survival horror game, but with RPG gameplay mechanics added to it. Sure, it definitely didn't feature a great story when compared to the original, and the setting was a little lackluster overall, but despite all of that, Parasite Eve 2 is still my favorite survival horror RPG game to this day. Aya Brea and Kyle Madigan are very interesting characters, the monster designs are truly terrifying, and the combat system is one of the most unique styles ever seen in a survival horror game, even 2 decades later. All in all, Parasite Eve 2 is a must-play survival horror game, and it's without a doubt one of the best survival horror games on the PlayStation 1. Number 3, Resident Evil. You can't have a list of the best PS1 survival horror games without featuring the game that inspired many other games to follow in its footsteps, now can you? Resident Evil, while not the first ever survival horror game, is arguably the game that put it on the map. It revolutionized the horror genre, and it led to not only 30 plus games in its own series, but inspired many other franchises that appeared on today's list as well. From the moment that we first walked through the front doors of the Spencer Mansion, us the players were greeted with an eerie soundtrack and setting that constantly left us with goosebumps every single time we entered a new room. The limited resources forced us to make tough decisions as to how we wanted to proceed each time we came across a new enemy. Zombies, hunters, a giant ass snake, the list goes on in terms of the horrifying yet memorable enemies we encountered during our first time in the Spencer Mansion. The 2 playable scenarios kept things fresh and added more replayability with different stories and interactions that could only be experienced in their respective campaigns. The Spencer Mansion to this day remains one of, if not the most iconic horror game setting in a survival horror game. For that reason and many others, Resident Evil deserves a spot in the top 3 best survival horror games on the PlayStation 1. Number 2, Silent Hill. Most Silent Hill games feature the same core aspects that you would find in most survival horror games. Limited resources, terrifying settings, puzzle solving, the list goes on. However, what really sets the first Silent Hill game apart from every other PS1 survival horror game is its storytelling. As a psychological horror game, Silent Hill had a more deep and captivating story than any other survival horror game on the PlayStation 1. following Harry Mason as he searched a town filled with monsters around every corner while also unveiling a conspiracy surrounding an ancient cult allowed the player to become invested with the story of Silent Hill. The terrifying set pieces within this foggy town helped make this game stand out as well. Whether it was the creepy Midwich elementary school that was filled with ghoulish children, or the terrifying Alchemilla hospital filled with faceless doctors and nurses, Silent Hill was arguably the scariest game on the original PlayStation 1 in terms of the atmosphere alone. If it wasn't for some of the gameplay mechanics being a bit clunky, even for a PS1 game, Silent Hill would have made a strong case for the #1 spot. Speaking of which, before we get to the #1 entry, if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to subscribe for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you really enjoyed today's topic. Finally, here's a few honorable mentions that just barely missed out on the top 10 PS1 survival horror games.
What's wrong?
Help! Someone is following me!
Some kind of weirdo?
Number 1, Resident Evil 2. RE2 is not only my favorite PS1 survival horror game, but it's my favorite video game of all time. I love this game, and it's the game that I've replayed more than any other game out there. Everything about this game screams masterpiece. From the character side of things, Leon and Claire were both featured in this game alongside other incredible side characters like Ada Wong and Sherry Birkin. Iconic monsters of the franchise were also featured in this game, including but not limited to the Licker, Mr. X, and William Birkin. From a gameplay side of things, it's one of the better survival horror experiences ever in a video game. Sure, it definitely lacks in the puzzle department, but definitely makes up for that with its limited resources, inventory management, iconic set pieces, and replayability. On the note of replayability, there's so much about Resident Evil 2 that really keeps you hooked long after the first playthrough of the game. The most notable feature is the A and B scenario combined with the zapping system. These mechanics motivate you to complete the game at least 4 times minimum. That's because you get specific puzzles and interactions with different characters in different ways based on the order you play through Leon and Claire's campaigns. As for post-game content, you get the Forge Survivor and Tofu Survivor, 2 iconic minigames that fans immediately fell in love with. And let's not forget that Resident Evil 2 arguably has the best soundtrack in a horror game of all time. Yeah, I mean that. I don't think I can name a single soundtrack that surpasses that of Resident Evil 2 when it comes to horror games. Overall, RE2 is the pinnacle of survival horror in my opinion, and it's not even close for me when it comes to which survival horror game on the PlayStation 1 is the best. It's 1000% Resident Evil 2, end of story, period. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Resident Evil 2 the best PS1 survival horror game, or is there a different game that deserves that title? Let me know down below. Also, shout out any PS1 horror games that I did include on this list. I know there's a lot out there like Countdown Vampires and Galerians, so be sure to throw your favorite PS1 survival horror game that didn't make my list in the comments down below. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.